February 1917, German U-boats began a new and unrelenting campaign against Allied shipping coming into and out of the British Isles. It was all an effort on the part of the Germans to try and win the First World War quickly and decisively before their situation deteriorated any further in the war. I'm John Buckley, and I teach on the History and War Studies degree programme here at the University of Wolverhampton, and we're going to be exploring some of those issues in this video. On January the 9th, 1917, key figures in the German High Command, the military and the Navy met with the Kaiser Castle Pless. And this decision, this discussion, was going to lead to one of the most important developments of the First World War. For a number of years, the Germans have been toying with the idea of conducting a U-boat campaign using submarines to attack Allied shipping going into and out of the British Isles. They tried in 1915, they tried again in 1916, but by 1917, the situation had dramatically changed. Germany's position in the war had deteriorated. There were real concerns about how long Germany could carry on fighting the war, and so Henning von Holtzendorf, chief of German naval staff, had proposed that Germany should adopt, as of the 1st of February 1917, a campaign which would be unrestricted in the way it was conducted against Allied shipping. Previously, submarines had been under strict orders to be very careful about what they targeted and how they targeted ships in and around the British Isles for fear of causing casualties to civilians and particularly to neutral civilians. In 1915, there had been a great scandal when the line of the Lusitania had been sunk by a German U-boat and over 1,200 people had died, and in particular, as far as the Americans were concerned, 128 Americans. This caused a major problem for the Germans, and they had scaled back on the U-boat operations in order to avoid the kind of problems that had created. There was a further problem in 1916, and so by 1917, the Germans had to come to a new decision, a new way of taking the risk of engaging with this U-boat warfare. So, at the Castle Pless meeting, the Kaiser was persuaded, and the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, by Holtzendorf and other members of the military, including the army, that this dramatic new measure was going to have to be brought in order to try and tip the balance of the war back in Germany's favour. Now, one of the problems that the German U-boats had, and this was the same in the Second World War as in the First War for the most part anyway, is that the U-boats at the time weren't true submarines. They were, in fact, more akin to a submersible torpedo boat. They travelled on the surface using diesel motors at about 16 knots. But once they went underwater, they had to switch using batteries, which weren't very efficient and didn't last very long, and speed dropped away to 8 knots or thereabouts. That meant that German U-boats really could submerge to avoid detection for short periods of time, but couldn't stay underwater or catch up with enemy ships whilst travelling underwater. So they preferred to operate on the surface. The other issue is that the torpedoes, what we usually associate submarines using, U-boats, to target enemy ships, had U-boats could only carry around 8, 10, possibly 12 of these torpedoes. So once you'd used all those torpedoes, you had to go back to base in order to re-equip. So U-boats preferred to use a deck gun. Each U-boat carried a gun on the top deck of the U-boat, and you fired that on the surface. And that was usually sufficient to stop an unarmed merchant ship and force it to surrender to you. Now, the previous rules of how you then dealt with an enemy ship once you captured it was that you would take the crew on board and you'd escort the ship to a neutral port or to your own port in order to confiscate any goods on the ship. That can't work for a U-boat because they can't carry the crew of a merchant ship. So generally, they had to sink the ship, which caused all sorts of problems and really annoyed the Americans during the First World War, who were very keen on international trade and using their shipping to supply Britain and Germany to a degree and other neutral powers in and around Europe. Consequently, when the rules were changed in February 1917, the Germans started this big, unrelenting, unrestricted campaign with no rules at all. All shipping in and around the British Isles was fair game, and the Germans were able to target anything they could find. And the effects were dramatic. In the early part of the First World War, although the Germans had success with U-boats, these restrictions had kept down the amount of ships and tonnage they had sunk of Allied shipping. But from February 1917 onwards, there was a huge explosion, and there were large numbers of casualties suffered by Allied shipping. The numbers and the tonnage rates really started to go through the roof. So monthly losses in 1914 have been around about 50,000 tons. By 1915, it was 70,000 tons. 1916, 100,000 tons per month. So it's creeping up. But in February 1917, 500,000 tons were sunk, and the same again in March. By April, it had shot up to 860,000 tons, and then hovered around the 600 to 700,000 tons in May and June. Now, this obviously was a major escalation and a real problem for the Allies about how they were going to cope with such excessive losses. That was well out of the range of what they could sustain for any long period of time. The German target, according to Holzendorf's memorandum, was to go for about 600,000 tons, and it was hoped per month. And this, it was hoped, would bring Britain to the point of surrender or compromise within a number of months. And interestingly, although the Germans realized that this might well bring the Americans into the war, because the Americans would react to this use of unrestricted submarine warfare, there was a perception that by the time the Germans were having to deal with the Americans, and the American army arriving in large numbers, the war would have come to an end. So the Americans would not be able to intervene in time to make any significant difference. That was a fundamental part of the gamble. As those tonnage rates started to increase to those kind of levels, it caused enormous panic in the Admiralty and in the British government. How could they cope? How could they manage with those kind of numbers? Admiral Jellicoe, who was by then the first Sea Lord, announced that Britain could not carry on with those rates. There was a real problem about how they could maintain the war effort. At one point, it was estimated there were only 6 weeks of food supplies available to Britain in the middle of this particular campaign. Yet, although the British were in a flap about this particular problem, they had certain things which they could do, and they reacted over the next few weeks and into the summer of 1917 in order to bring this problem under control. The biggest measure that they employed was the introduction of the convoy in shipping coming into and out of the British Isles. Now, it's one of those big questions in history. Why did it take them so long to adopt convoy when it seemed retrospectively to the main solution to the problem? Well, there were good reasons at the time. Convoys were difficult to organize. You needed good and disciplined escort groups to look after the convoys. In order to make sure that the ships were, once they were bunched together, because previously ships had sailed individually, if you put them all together, you've got to have particular rules and ways in which the ships will cooperate with each other, how they will stick to basic rules and all go at the same speed. That was considered to be very difficult to organize. And the perception was that organizing that would slow down shipping rates more than the losses being sustained by the U-boats attacking ships individually out at sea. By the late spring of 1917, it was clear that that was unsustainable as an argument. So the Admiralty accepted that convoy was going to have to be the solution, and they rapidly introduced them, introducing measures in which large numbers of ships were collected together and escorted by Royal Naval vessels. This created a significant problem for the U-boats. The U-boats had been used to operating separately and individually and picking off ships as they moved across the shipping lanes. They couldn't do that anymore. If they attacked a convoy, and generally speaking, they couldn't then operate on the surface because the escorting Royal Naval vessels would stop them and intercept them. And Royal Naval escort vessels were larger and better armed for surface fighting than U-boats. The only way the U-boats could then deal with that problem was to submerge. But that then meant they couldn't often keep up with the convoys. They only had a limited number of torpedoes they could use. And so their ability to influence and shape what was going on in the shipping lanes with the movement of trade into and out of Britain really started to fall back, and losses started to be brought back under control. They still remained high, but nonetheless, they were much less of a problem than they'd previously been. One of the other measures that the British introduced in 1917 and started using right through to the end of the war, a new technological development, was the use of air power to support convoys. The aircraft themselves did not have the ability to damage or affect the U-boats directly in a physical sense, but they could observe them, locate them, and pinpoint where they were. And then this would force the U-boats to go away from where the convoys were or to submerge. Once they were underwater, their speed fell away. They ran their batteries down, so they weren't able to get close to the convoy. So it was more of what was later described as a scarecrow effect. Put your aircraft around a convoy, and the convoys become much less vulnerable. Indeed, the entirety of the First World War, a convoy covered by air cover lost only a handful of ships. So about less than 5, it is estimated. So air cover and convoying solved the problem of the U-boats. And this was going to be a real problem for the Germans. They couldn't use their U-boats in the way they'd wanted. It hadn't had the major effect that they'd hoped for. America had now joined the war, and the situation in the Great War was deteriorating rapidly for them. The effects of the U-boat campaign caught the Germans out to a significant degree. They profoundly miscalculated how the British would react and what the implications of the campaign would be. One of the key things they have failed to take into account was how the British would set up and reorganize the use of imports, how they'd be careful about certain kinds of foodstuff that were bringing into the UK, and how they would manage the distribution effectively. In addition, they'd miscalculated how much in the way of neutral shipping would be brought into the process of keeping the Allied war effort maintained. They'd imagined, the Germans, that the neutral shipping would stay away. But what happened was that British and American Allied shipping was used in the more dangerous areas, and other types, other nationalities of shipping was used elsewhere in the world system to take the pressure off. So the problem of the estimate of 600,000 tons proved to be a significant underestimation about how much they would have to sink. The British also were considered by the Germans, and it is in the Holzendorf memorandum, the document that was used by the Germans for the start of this program, that they imagined that the British were actually soft, that they wouldn't actually get to grips with the problems of managing a campaign such as this, that they weren't organized, that the British people weren't used to the privations, they weren't of war in the same way that German people who were suffering the British blockade of Germany, they were having to adapt to those situations. They didn't think the British would be able to do the same. There was a severe underestimation of the ability of the British and the Allies to manage a situation, and that caused real problems for the Germans. The U-boat campaign in the First World War in many ways set out some of the features that will be later explored in the Battle of the Atlantic in the Second World War, which is perhaps better known. But in both cases, these campaigns fundamentally altered the way in which the First World War and the Second World War unfolded, and ultimately who was victorious. It integrated many aspects of technology, decision-making, strategy, and politics into shaping the conduct of those wars. There are many of the features that we explore in the War Cities degree program here at the University of Wolverhampton, where we examine many of those aspects and features in terms of politics and strategy, decision making. We even get students to explore decision making in strategy games, where you play out in the First and the Second World War, exploring aspects of the U-boat campaigns. If you want to know more, follow the link below.